All right, welcome to lecture 1.3, the first chapter's lecture. It's the last one of the micro lectures, I believe. We're going to look at the difference between substantive and procedural due process. We're going to use that kind of as a lens to focus on the whole idea of constitutional interpretation. Okay, first of all, this idea of due process, we're going to find it in two parts of the Constitution, the Fifth and the 14th Amendment. Now, the Fifth Amendment was part of the Bill of Rights. It came shortly after the drafting of the Constitution. So we're talking about the 1780s or the 18th century. The 14th Amendment came shortly after the American Civil War with the abolition of slavery, and we had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. So taken together, they read, and I just cut out small parts and put a nor in, but just to make it read right. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That was the Fifth Amendment. Now, for reasons that don't really concern us in this lecture, initially it seemed that the Bill of Rights applied only to the action of the federal government. By the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we are saying that the Bill of Rights and due process then applies to state government as well. So we have, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, simple definition is what's due process? Well, due process really is divided into two broad categories, substantive and procedural. Substantive due process is the content of the law itself. A simple way of looking at it is, what did you make illegal? And we ask, is that fair? So if I said I'm going to make jaywalking illegal and punishable by death, the Constitution would say, well, that's just a violation of substantive due process. You've gone too far with that. If you've got a fine, we're okay with it. But death, no. Procedural due process is the application of the law. So let's suppose I pass a law which is seemingly neutral. I say, I'm going to have the death penalty if you commit murder. But let's suppose in a state, pick a state, Wyoming, we'll say, that the only people executed in Wyoming for murder are, make up a group, albino, hermaphrodites who are blind and were born in Botswana. I'm just making up things there. If everybody executed in Wyoming was only in those categories, you would say, well, the law is apparently neutral, but in its application, you're really discriminating against this one group. Therefore, it's unconstitutional. Okay. Unfortunately for us, having given you a definition, there's no constitutional definition. There's no little asterisk or appendix that says, okay, when we use this in the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment, this is what due process means. So the term has to be defined. And that job has pretty much been left up to the Supreme Court of the United States. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States is rather divided about how you interpret the Constitution. There's lots of different ways you can do this. I gave 3 off the bat, but there's dozens more, including one of which I'm going to focus on, 2 of which. Textualism, original meaning, judicial precedent, all those are ways. Living Constitution, which I'm going to talk about, and constructionist or strict constructionist, which is another. So let's look at what could be called the conservative approach. This basically laser focuses on the language and the history of the text. So due process would be defined as what the founders meant it to mean in the 1780s and what the Civil War generation meant it to mean in the 1860s and 70s. Former Justice Scalia, who died about 5 years ago now, I guess, said the Constitution should be interpreted in accordance with its original meaning, that is, the meaning it had at the time of its enactment. So you go back in time and you figure out what was meant by the words when they were written. You don't define it as what you mean today. Now, obviously, there's problems with that. When you say you want to go back and define what due process means, so let's go back to the original Fifth Amendment. The Constitution of the United States was drafted by dozens of people and was written, most people say by and large, by James Madison. So let's suppose you could claim that Madison actually wrote out the Fifth Amendment. Well, do we say, well, what did Madison think it meant? Or let's suppose that it was voted on in a committee and the committee voted 7 to 11 to pass the Fifth Amendment. Do we look at what a majority of that committee thought it meant? And then, of course, the Constitution is ratified by the states. Do we look at the voters in those states? Or do we just look at the legislatures? I mean, it's not as easy as you think. And then you have the problem that terminology changes over time and technology changes us. So if we use the Second Amendment, the right of the people to bear arms, when that was written in the 1780s, arms pretty much meant relatively primitive weapons, flintlocks, muskets. There were some rifles, but realistically muskets. Should we limit it in time to just that, or should we more broadly interpret it, which brings us to the living constitution, or what's sometimes called the liberal approach. So this approach says that really the Constitution is a living document. And the meaning of what's in the Constitution changes as society changes. And you need to adapt the Constitution to the needs of today and focus not on the literal words and the original meanings. And this allows the Constitution to be a living embodiment of the rights of the people, not just a permanent list of what people thought it meant. There are some problems with this. Doesn't this allow a judge to substitute his own thinking for what the original people thought? And doesn't this give judges an inordinate amount of power? So sometimes you'll hear them called activist judges. Now, you're going to have to make this decision yourself because it's being made in the Supreme Court every day. Do we look at the original meaning or the meaning to us today? And who gets to define the terms? If you say, well, we should go back to the 1800s, aren't you really saying that the judge gets to impose his opinion today as to what he thinks it should be? So it's kind of a paradox or a cycle. Should we be consistent across the whole Constitution? Should rights be interpreted one way and government procedure another? And how do we fit on new ideas and new problems? How do we address them? Okay, well that is our last lecture in this, and I will stop here and wish you well.